welcome to the archive. Søren Sindbæk. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, that's good.
Good. I got that right. All right, so we're going to talk about King BlueTooth, a very prominent figure in history. So much so we have technology literally named after him, and he's a very famous symbol for it. On all of our phones, we have what is called BlueTooth settings, and I'm very curious to know more about the story behind the man himself, who he was, and why was he as a person so profoundly impactful that we have technology named after him.
Funny story, isn't it? That everybody has the Bluetooth device and is familiar with this little icon. I don't know if you know, the Bluetooth symbol are actually the runes H and B combined. And you can see those runes in Harald's famous runestone at Jelling in Denmark. So the device is very much named after him. Whether he has anything to do with that or deserve that honor, well, we'll see about that once we've been through the story, I guess. But he's certainly become a very, very famous character. He became a very famous character in the lore and myth making about the Viking Age. Obviously, he was a central actor. He was a king in his times, but he's one of those people whose legacy grows, in all sorts of strange directions. So it's very difficult today to keep track of what is actually Harald BlueTooth and what are all the stories. And we also keep adding to those stories today. And some of that fame he's achieved is actually not due to what was preserved of his memory, but due to what archaeologists have discovered in the 20th century and the 21st century. So he has taken on a new character that was forgotten, and maybe he's also been constructed into something he never was. But that's the case with a lot of history. So I think we should go back to the beginning, and I can tell you about what people knew and what they thought about him in the Viking Age, and then we can see how his legacy grows from that. Okay?
Sounds fantastic.
Yeah. So if we sort of scratch all later legend and all archaeological knowledge and just concentrate for the beginning on what we know from the Viking Age, from his time, there's really only a handful of sources, and so we know he was a king because he commissioned this great runestone in Jelling, which is unlike every other runestone existing. It's got elaborate decoration in 3D relief, beautiful carvings, and a long text that looks to some more like a book writing in lines than it looks like the typical runestone. So a very, very strange but fascinating memorial. And well, he says he's king of the Danes, and he raised this to commemorate his father who was king and to his mother. And it's conspicuous that he mentioned his mother, because honestly, Vikings didn't do that a lot. We have lots of runestones that's commissioned for men. We've got some that's commissioned by women, but it's very rare to mention to raise a stone in commemoration of a woman. So she was important somehow. Okay, we'll stick to that. So he raises this, and he tells us he's king of Denmark. He became king. He won Denmark for himself. That sounds like there was a battle. And he won Norway, and he made the Danes Christian. Wow, that's quite a feat. How many people in history have changed the religion of their people? This is serious. I mean, Christianity was not unknown. There would have been Christians who had, well, independently and individually taken up Christianity. But until Harald's day, the sort of mainstream culture in Viking Age Denmark was pagan, Norse. And pretty soon after his time, we can see that, for instance, the standard way of being buried is in a Christian fashion at a church. So he really did something there. That's the key. That's what we should focus on. Of course, you can say things that are, well, let's say, to your advantage when you commission your own memorials. But you can't lie outright very easily on a runestone because everybody can tell you wrong. So we know that. Then there's another runestone that's commissioned by his wife. He says she's the wife of Harald the Good, Gorm's son. All right, this is our guy. And she also tells us that she is the daughter of Mistivoy, who's a Slavic prince. We know him. He was a prince in Harald's neighboring kingdom. So he marries a Slavic princess from a neighboring kingdom. And obviously, she might have been a very nice person, but more likely than not, there's an aspect of alliance in that. So we know those things. And then there is a famous source, a chronicle written in Harald's time by a guy called Widukind, who sets out to really write the history, the grand history of the German Emperor Otto I, who's contemporary with Harald. And he mentions Harald twice, right? So he first he writes that sort of incidentally there is this rebellion up north in Saxony, and a Saxon prince approaches Harald to ask him to join the rebellion. And Harald is apparently reluctant. And then a little later, we get a whole story about how all of a sudden Harald is converted to Christianity he's convinced apparently by this monk, Popo, who visits him. It's a long story with miracles and everything. The one odd thing, though, is that in a book that's really designed to commemorate Otto I, there's no mention that Otto has any role in that. And this is really important. So that the historians believe that that's it, what really happened is that the bishop in Cologne sent out a mission to damage control this rebellion. And Harald really got a really good offer that he could, be recognized as a Christian king without having to install a clerisy and pledge allegiance to the emperor and all that. I think that's the best we know from the sources. That's how we can reconstruct it. And that's the original Harald. And then lore takes on. So the first thing that happens to Harald's legacy is actually not too long after his death, but still sort of a couple of generations. People start to, construct history, and they start to try and read history in a different way. And Harald sort of takes on a couple of different myths. One myth is very simple. That's in the German bishopric of Bremen, who wants to control all of Scandinavia. And in the past, they had even forged documents to claim that the emperor had, the Pope had allowed them to do so. So about 100 years after Harald's death, a great history is written about the Hamburg-Bremen seat. And Harald features prominently. And now Harald is this king who is subdued, not by Otto I, but Otto II. He's subdued by him and pledges allegiance. The emperor becomes the godfather of his son, and he's defeated in battle, and he becomes a good Christian because of the emperor. And now we know from the contemporary source that that's all made up. But nevertheless, if you go to most German books today, that's the story that will tell. It's a pretty good story for Germany, right? They really convert the Danish. Yeah. So have a look at German Wikipedia. At least last time when I lived there, that's the story you get about Harold, the good, loyal servant of the emperor. And then there's another story coming up, because they also need to explain that. So why didn't the Hamburg-Bremen church get a foothold right away? Now that was because of his son, right? So they made up this story that his son, Sweyn Forkbeak, rejects Christianity. And suddenly, we have a full drama of family opposition. One is Christian, one is pagan. That's also completely made up because Sweyn, we know, commissioned churches. He conquers England, becomes the king of England, and accepts, to be king in a Christian country. So he's a Christian, but story has it differently. And that's where things start to get strange. So a little later, again in the 12th and 13th century, they start, now Harold is a very distant king, and the kind you make stories about, like our song about Good King Wenceslas. He's really just a name from olden times. And we get even more exciting stories about how Harold were in all these wars, and he had these almost like crusader knights before the fact, the Jomsvikinger. And all that is clearly put together by, mainly in Orkney and in Iceland, by people who, had some legends about olden days, but they also just construct great stories. And until modern times, that's the story that people have known about Harold BlueTooth. And you can shake your head if you're a historian, because you look at these stories and you can really see a lot of this is just great fairy tales. Harold becomes this tragic king, actually, in those stories. He is it's got all the trappings of a good fairy tale. He's too greedy and offends his friends, and they turn against him, and revenge is taken, and he gets a humiliating death. Well, if there ever was a Viking fairy tale, here it is. But that's probably got very little to do with what that guy originally was. But still, even when I went to school many years ago, that's pretty much what we've been told. But then came archaeology, and that's the rebirth of Harold BlueTooth. Because in the 1980s, there was a shock discovery that the famous ring fortresses, Viking Age ring fortresses that is built in Denmark, there are at least 4 or 5 of these very, very large, impressive, and very strict geometrical constructions. It was shown by tree-ring datings that they were constructed by Harold BlueTooth. Nobody had expected that. Right? People thought they were maybe Sweyn Forkbeard's army camps for conquering England or something. But suddenly, it was revealed that this sort of grid of fortresses across Denmark was the feat of Harold BlueTooth. Now, what is that about? And that's basically the reason why we're so interested in him today, because he clearly did something that no Viking king had done before. He creates these massive strongholds in a way that kings have just never worked before. And that's why in the last generation or so, he's become such an obsession for archaeologists and historians. And what most people think, at least, is that these fortresses has to do with that line you remember from the Jelling runestone, right? One for himself, all of Denmark. How would he have done that? Fortresses might have come in handy, right? So that's what we believe now, and that's actually the reason why that logo is on your phone, because the data engineer who produced the BlueTooth system, who's a Swede, he knew that story about how Harold BlueTooth had taken this crazy northern kingdom of independent Vikings and unified it into one kingdom. And he thought, well, that's pretty much what we want the Bluetooth device to do, to connect a lot of very, very dispersed and different gadgets and so that is basically that's the rebirth of Herald Bluetooth as an important and independent thing. And it's also a story, I think, of how archaeology is rewriting. Well, it's rewriting what we think about history, but it's even rewriting how we read the sources. Because if it hadn't been for those discoveries, we would pretty much still portray him as this unlucky king that the Icelanders and Orkney saga writers in the High Middle Ages invented for us.
Wow, that is wild. That really is. Now, there's also tied in with archaeology.
Yeah.
There's a huge mystery as well with King Bluetooth. Not only are we still trying to figure out, our archaeologists trying to discover how he made all those fortresses in such a span of time, but there's also a mystery too, like with his death. And let me know if I'm wrong with this. I'm not an archaeologist or a historian, but also in kind of the collapse of his empire, there was a bit of a mystery that's emerged from that as well. Like, a lot of people are trying to figure out sort of the scattered pieces at the end of his tale, what happened to him and where he could be buried.
That's a real mystery also. It's a great mystery. Now, Harold is not the only Viking king whose burial we don't know. But, I mean, he's a kind of character who ought to have had a very prominent burial. And for many years, it was believed that he had. The medieval historians wrote that he was buried in the church that he had constructed in Roskilde. In the cathedral in Roskilde, there was a pillar with his name that says this is where he's buried. However, when that pillar was opened, there was nothing. It was empty. It was just, a symbolic burial there. And that, of course, opens the question. And there's been all sorts of speculation. So some people thought maybe, wouldn't he be buried in Lund, in Skåne, in southern Sweden? Because that was actually what developed into the real capital of his kingdom. Or could he be buried in Jelling, where his mother and father were buried? And under the first church in Jelling, there is actually a burial found from the 10th century that, for all we know, it might just be Harold, except for the fact that the jewelry, there was not a lot found in that grave, but there were a few pieces. And the styles there are something that we would expect for, a generation a little more before Harold. So people tend to believe that it's probably a reburial of his father. But then on top of that, there's this other lead that some of the later stories and sagas claim that he died after a battle that was taken to Wolin in Poland, which is not completely out of the question. That could really be because we know that Harold had allies among the Slavs, and Wolin was really a great hub at the time in the late 10th century. So it's not at all unlikely that this would have been, if let's say that he was wounded and hunted out of the kingdom. Let's say that it's right that there was this battle with his son. Wolin would have been a very obvious place to put him. So people have also been speculating whether that could be. And then recently, some people believe that a new source has emerged. It's a very contested document. Some people believe it's a forgery. Some people believe it might have been maybe a lost medieval source. But anyway, that source sort of lends or suggests that Volin is the place. So recently there's been a sort of new treasure hunt for Harold BlueTooth's grave in Volin. But basically, the jury is out. We don't know where this guy is buried.
Okay. That, yeah, can definitely see the very complicated mystery.
Yeah. But also it's a question, and this is where archaeology just I mean you need to understand archaeology because the question is really, if we found Harold BlueTooth's grave, how would we recognize it? How would we be sure that it's Harold BlueTooth? There's very few graves that comes with a label saying this is such and such a person, and certainly not from the Viking Age. So what would we expect? For all we know, well, he was a Christian. Maybe he was not buried with splendors. If he was a king 100 years later, we would expect that he was buried in a nice sarcophagus in the crypt of a cathedral. But what's his understanding of that? There are no stone cathedrals in his kingdom. There are only wooden churches. Was he buried in one of those? Was he buried under the church? If he was just put in as a good Christian in a grave without any trappings, well, perhaps we found him. Perhaps he's lying there in some anthropology lab labeled, but we simply don't know what he is. Or maybe he could be still waiting to be discovered in one of the great cathedrals. Obviously, these places have rarely been fully excavated. It's quite a thing to try and excavate the floor of a great church or cathedral. Or it could even be that he was buried there, and then when they rebuilt these giant Gothic cathedrals, they scooped up the old graves, and we'll never know. Yeah. So it is a mystery, but whether it's a mystery we'll ever know is another matter. But that shouldn't, discourage us.
Yeah, no, it shouldn't discourage us. And I'm curious, why might it be so difficult for us to ID these graves? Was there a particular belief or a practice, or it was just at that time people didn't really mark their graves?
Time of Harold's father, Gorm, that was mentioned on the runestone. We see a lot of graves from noble people, princes, high-ranking individuals that get a very elaborate funeral. You might construct a chamber for them and put grave goods, jewelry, weapons there. And in Jelling, there are two great mounds, and in one of the mounds there is a grave like that, which have been we can tree ring date it. It fits with the time when Gorm died. That's probably where he was buried. So he would have had a burial like that. We also know that burial was, let's say, it was emptied. Whether it was robbed or whether it was transferred is a big discussion. Some people believe that Harold deliberately opened the grave and sort of Christianed his father after the fact, and that it's actually the guy we have under the church. But had Harold been a king of that generation, chances are that are better, at least, that we would know his burial, because people get buried in a conspicuous way that really shows their rank. But Christian burials is a completely different thing. The Christian ideal in the Middle Ages is that you should not flaunt any of your wealth. You should lie in your humble garment, but waiting for resurrection. And if everybody does that, it really gets difficult to tell who is who. And since Harold is sitting right there at the time of conversion, well, unless there had been a source actually describing this is how we buried him, well, he could have done pretty much anything. We have examples of people in the early Christian period who gets buried with furnishings because, well, nobody told them not to. But we also have what seems to be very high-ranking graves, for instance, graves put right in front of the altar in a church. So that has nothing at all. And again, if it's true that this guy died of wounds in a battle and was taken up, did he ever get a sort of proper burial, or was his bones put in a chest and kept? Maybe there was an idea that he should be canonized as a saint. Lots of royals were at the time, so it's perfectly possible that when he died, his bones were kept in that way. Later, of course, especially when his son took the throne and was not very kind to his memory, perhaps that plan just simply was scrapped, and all you have are some bones in a box that nobody really cares about anymore because they're not a saint in a way. So that's why that could be some reasons why that part of the story is still not known to us. There's actually quite a lot of ways where a king can disappear. But do you remember the story about Richard III, who was found in a parking lot? Yeah. So that had been a mystery for 300 years. Where's the King of England? Well, he was in the parking lot.
And they found him there one day.
Yeah. And eventually you could identify him because of his physical characteristics and DNA and stuff. We probably even couldn't, well, for now we would not be able to ID him if we had his bones, because we haven't got any of his close relatives either. So it would take quite a bit of luck to know exactly that we had found the guy. And the question is also whether that is how much wiser that will make us, because what's really interesting about Harold BlueTooth as it looks today are the his monuments and his politics. And it's actually not just the ring fortresses. The Great Ring Fortresses are many people have heard about them because they were recently accepted as UNESCO World Heritage Site. So they're now inscribed on the same list as the pyramids in Giza or Taj Mahal, really as something that has a universal value. And you can ask, well, is it such a big deal? These are turf and timber constructions from the 10th century. But it is sort of a big deal because there had been nothing like that in this part of the world before. And he constructed these they're visually very similar, completely straight, almost like a Roman army camp. And he constructed 5 of them in present Denmark, and 1 or 2 more in present Sweden, which was part of his kingdom. So he's really building a network of fortresses. Nobody in Scandinavia had done that before. Then he builds the Jelling monuments with that strange runestone, very fascinating runestone, and the mounds. And we also know that at Jelling he constructed a giant palisade, 1,200 feet in each direction, which, just like his fortress, is super geometrical, very exact. So that's sort of his signature. And we also know that at his southern border, he constructed a great border defense, the Dannevirke. Again, tree ring dates have revealed that no chronicle mentions that. But all of those great feats, which must really have been spectacular in his times, they've been revealed by archaeology. So we also see that, the inherited stories, sometimes they're just stories, and not just were they made up, but they conceal real happenings that were perhaps much more interesting.
Yeah. Does it give us, from both the politics and what we know, what's for certain, what's on the book, do we get any kind of sense as to who he was or what it was like?
Well, there is a funny sentence in one of the sources in Wiederkind that says that he was eager to listen but slow to speak. And we don't know what that's about, but it sounds like, an observation. Why would you put that unless it was just something that happened to be true? So that gives you, a clue, not, sort of a big enterprising, hot-headed person, but, a strategist who thinks over his possibilities and listens to all the options, and then obviously, as his monument shows, takes action. So that's one thing. The other thing, how he was liked, that's much more difficult because there are all these stories starting from the 11th century that he was unpopular, and some of them has a grain of or a ring of truth to them. At least we see that all the fortresses ended up being burnt down. His coins, he was one of the first rulers to issue coins in Scandinavia. His coins stopped circulating, and there are no sort of great deeds told about him in the generation or so after. So there's something fishy there. And our best guess today is that all these construction works that he undertook actually, must have put a high toll on his people. I don't think his warriors were put to cut turfs and build fortresses, but their thralls, their slaves, almost certainly were. That's how you would have constructed something like that at the time. Go out to your chosen followers and say, well, you get your men out there, we need a fortress. But it's still a lot of resources to pull out for really no gain. Remember, this is a time when a real king is expected to lavish his followers with great gifts, which obviously they take in battle and in successful wars. So a king who built fortresses instead of leading battles, that's not really a king who's going to impress Viking Age Scandinavians in the long run. So it's very possible that people didn't sort of think of him as favorably as you might think for somebody who leads his people to convert to a new religion and construct these great monuments. But maybe he didn't have a very free hand, because what we also know is that in the younger Otto II, we actually know that he initiated a war against the Danes, and that means against Terror. So he was a king under siege, unlike earlier rulers in Denmark who pretty much had a free reign because all the action was away from the country. Harold is facing a crisis, and he weathers that crisis. So today we probably assess him quite positively. But in his days, people might have thought of this as a very troubled time when everybody had to, pull together and raise defenses rather than what they'd rather do, go out and plunder and get rich.
Yeah. So he's probably facing a lot of adversity the entirety of his reign.
That's what we get. Actually, there's one more source that mentions him. We have, I'm sure you know, the famous skaldic poetry, which is really praise poetry that was made by great poets, mainly from Iceland. The Icelanders were the most famous skalds, and they often took up a post in the Norwegian kings at the Norwegian king's court. The Norwegian kings tended really to sponsor skalds, and there is this great poem to Håkon Jarl, the Norwegian ruler. Bellow is the name of the poem, and it mentions amongst all the good things that Håkon does, there is this mention that once in the wintertime, in the time of the frost, the Danish king summoned him, and they went to the rampart and won the battle together. Now that sounds a little bit odd, but we actually can figure out what it's about, because it's about that war initiated by Otto. Otto II attacked the fortress rampart at the southern border of Denmark, but the fact that Harold had to summon an ally all the way from Norway really shows he's in trouble. There must be a lot of allies that's closer to, and if he even goes to the length of, you know, sending a fast messenger all the way to Norway to assemble all the men they can, I'm sure that everybody else in his own kingdom was called up. So it really is a crisis. And it probably happens after the yelling episode, where in the runestone there, he seems very assertive and triumphant. But then later in his reign, he faces this crisis, and that's probably when the ring fortresses are constructed, because the tree rings we have suggest that this is the 970s, 980s, just coinciding with that threat from his great enemy. But we also know that he wasn't actually conquered. What happens is that Otto II has many wars to fight, and eventually dies in Italy in 983. So, and he never defeats the Danes. By contrast, there is a great rebellion against the empire when he dies. And his heir is a 3-year-old son. So when he dies, everybody knows that there's not going to be another war leader for the next 10-15 years. And that's pretty much the time when Harold must have faced opposition. So maybe it's a very simple story. He was a war leader who fell from grace once the battle was over. That's not an unknown story in history. But then the question many people ask is, okay, so if he are we celebrating the one Viking king who never conquered anything? Well, he actually did conquer. I mean, he clearly won a kind of power in Denmark that no Viking king had previously. He won. He was acknowledged as a king in Norway, which is quite a feat also. And the kind of organization that he must have created for these fortresses to make that work could still be a very good part of the explanation why his son eventually is able to become arguably the most successful Viking king ever, because he's the king who takes those huge Danegeld treasures in England during the first decade of the second millennium, and eventually goes on to be King of England in 1013. So Harold clearly started something that had repercussions long after his reign.
Is there anything else you'd like to share, Søren?
I think this is it's such a fascinating. We could go on talking about Harold BlueTooth because partly because there is clearly such a fascinating history going on, but also partly because it reveals just how much is still unknowns, how many well-known unknowns there is to Viking history. The ring fortresses certainly is one thing that I mean, there are these massive monuments that, well, they've been excavated, or some of them have been excavated, but there's still so much waiting to be seen. And can you believe it? There's never been an English language book about these. For all the things that people write about, you can only write little papers or very elaborate reports on the individual excavations and so on. So I think there's a lot to be discovered for an international audience. They're fantastic sites to visit. So I mean, if you ever come to do a Viking tour of Denmark, this should be your first ports of call. Great places and great museums in several of those. And it's a bit of a sort of undiscovered gem for most tourists.
Yeah.
I've recently completed a book about the first one that was found, Trelleborg, which should come out. It will be the first book in English about the Trelleborg fortress. And if I succeed, I'll go on to write a little book about each of these. Each of them just have their own. They clearly have their own history, but they also have had their own sort of history of research that actually be sort of really important focus points for how we have got to learn about Viking Age. Not just excavating, finding out the plans, but realizing the finds for what they are, sorting out the very strange burial grounds that are at least in two of them, with some of the most talked about burials in the Viking world. The Völva from Fyrkat, probably a pagan priestess buried in this fortress, or the possibly Slavic prince buried in Trelleborg. So there are so many stories connected to these places that are waiting to be unlocked. And well, if I have the good luck to write all these books, they'll finally be sort of great little place to get that knowledge. But the first one should be coming out later this year.
Great. I look forward to getting myself a copy.
Yeah.
Can I order a signed one from you?
I definitely will.
Awesome. Okay, thank you.